Remember when farmhouse grandmas made 60 candies from whatever grew on the farm, and most families today have completely forgotten them? Sorghum taffy, hickory nut brittle, maple cream, none of it cost a penny at the store. These homemade sweets helped rural families survive the Depression without buying candy. Today, they've vanished. Even though they taste better, pulled buttermints were the soft, creamy candies Grandma made for weddings and special occasions. She stood at the stove with a pot of sugar, butter, heavy cream, and a little water. The mixture cooked slowly over medium heat until it reached soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. When it was ready, she poured it onto a buttered marble slab and let it cool until she could handle it. Then she added a few drops of peppermint oil, not extract, pure peppermint oil, and started pulling the candy. She buttered her hands and stretched the candy out and folded it back, over and over, for about 10 minutes. The candy started out glossy and translucent. As she pulled it, it turned opaque and creamy white. The pulling incorporated tiny air bubbles that made it light and soft. When it was the right consistency, she rolled it into a long rope and cut it into small pieces with scissors. Each piece was shaped like a little pillow. The mints dried for a day on wax paper and turned slightly firm on the outside, but stayed soft inside. They tasted buttery and minty and dissolved on the tongue. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1955. By the 1970s, hard after-dinner mints replaced soft buttermints. Pulled buttermints vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. They were the fancy candy Grandma made for Christmas and wrapped in wax paper. Cream walnuts were the hand-dipped farmhouse treat, made with walnut halves and homemade fondant. Grandma stood at the kitchen counter with a bowl of no-cook fondant she had made the day before. Powdered sugar, corn syrup, and vanilla kneaded until smooth. She pinched off small pieces of fondant and pressed a walnut half into each piece, sandwiching the nut between 2 layers of white fondant. The fondant dried for a day on wax paper until it was firm enough to handle. Then she melted chocolate in a double boiler, real chocolate, all not candy coating, and dipped each walnut fondant into the melted chocolate with a fork. The excess chocolate dripped off, and she set each piece back on the wax paper to harden. The cream walnuts came out glossy and dark, with the walnut visible through the chocolate if you held it up to the light. Each piece had a creamy white center and a crunchy walnut. They tasted sweet and nutty and melted on the tongue. The fondant was soft, and the chocolate was rich. Grandma put them in a tin lined with wax paper and gave them as gifts. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1954 and made about 3 dozen pieces. By the 1970s, store-bought chocolates were easier and cheaper than making them by hand. Dipping each piece in chocolate took hours. Cream walnuts vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. They tasted sweet, salty, and spicy all at the same time. Spiced nuts were the farmhouse candy made with pecans, or walnuts coated in caramelized sugar and spices. Grandma spread 2 cups of nut halves on a baking sheet and toasted them in a low oven until they smelled nutty. While the nuts toasted, she made the coating on the stove. In a heavy pot, she mixed a cup of sugar, a 1/4 cup of water, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and a pinch of salt. She cooked it over medium heat without stirring until it reached soft ball stage. The sugar syrup turned amber and smelled like caramel and cinnamon. When it was ready, she poured the hot nuts into the syrup and stirred quickly with a wooden spoon until every nut was coated. Then she spread the coated nuts back onto the buttered baking sheet, separating them with a fork so they wouldn't stick together in clumps. The nuts cooled and the sugar coating hardened into a crunchy shell. Each nut was glossy and coated with a thick layer of spiced sugar. They tasted sweet from the sugar, warm from the cinnamon, and salty from the salt. The nuts were crunchy and addictive. Grandma kept them in a tin and served them at Christmas. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1955. By the 1970s, store-bought candied nuts were easier to buy than to make. Spiced nuts vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. It was the soft, a melt-in-your-mouth candy that had to be kept in a cool place, or it would soften. Cream candy was the farmhouse treat made with heavy cream, sugar, and butter. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of heavy cream, the thick kind that came from the farm separator. She added 2 cups of sugar and a tablespoon of butter. The mixture cooked slowly over low heat, stirring constantly until it reached soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. The candy smelled rich and sweet while it cooked. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool for a few minutes. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. She added vanilla extract and kept beating until the candy was thick and creamy. Then she poured it into a buttered pan and let it set in a cool place, the cellar or the back porch in winter. The candy firmed up but stayed soft and creamy. It tasted rich and buttery and melted on the tongue. The heavy cream made it smooth. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, people didn't have cool cellars to store it in, and the candy would soften in warm kitchens. Cream candy vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. They were the precursor to Rice Krispie treats, but made with popcorn and dark molasses. Candied popcorn squares were the farmhouse candy made by pressing molasses-coated popcorn into a pan. Grandma popped a big pot of popcorn on the stove in a little oil. The popcorn went into a large bowl, and she picked out any unpopped kernels. On the stove, she made a thick molasses syrup, 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of sugar, and a tablespoon of butter cooked to soft crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard threads. When the syrup was ready, she poured it over the popcorn and stirred quickly with a wooden spoon until every kernel was coated. Then she pressed the sticky popcorn into a buttered 9x13 pan, packing it down firmly with the back of a spoon. The popcorn had to be pressed tight or it would fall apart when cut. The squares cooled and hardened into firm bars. When they were set, she cut them into squares with a knife. Each square was dark and sticky, with popcorn held together by thick molasses. They tasted sweet and chewy with a hint of bitterness from the molasses. The popcorn stayed crunchy inside. A batch cost about 25 cents to make in 1951. By the 1960s, marshmallow treats replaced molasses popcorn squares. Candied popcorn squares vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. It was heavy on the salt and butter and light on the corn syrup. Caramel corn was the farmhouse candy made by coating popcorn with thick caramel and baking it until crispy. Grandma popped a big pot of popcorn on the stove and spread it out on 2 large baking sheets. On the stove, she made the caramel, a stick of butter, a cup of brown sugar, a 1/4 cup of corn syrup, and a teaspoon of salt. The mixture cooked over medium heat, stirring constantly until it reached soft ball stage. When it was ready, she stirred in a teaspoon of baking soda. The caramel foamed up and turned lighter in color. She poured the hot caramel over the popcorn and stirred it with a wooden spoon until every kernel was coated. The baking sheets went into a low oven, 250 degrees, and baked for an hour. She stirred the popcorn every 15 minutes so it would coat evenly and not burn. When it came out, and the caramel corn was crispy and golden, it cooled on the pans and she broke it into clusters. The caramel corn tasted buttery and salty with a deep caramel flavor from the brown sugar. It was crunchy and addictive. The salt balanced the sweetness. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1954 and filled 2 big bowls. By the 1980s, store-bought caramel corn was easier to buy. Caramel corn vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It was grainy and crumbly, not smooth like modern fudge. Chocolate fudge was the old-fashioned farmhouse candy made without marshmallows or condensed milk. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, 3 tablespoons of cocoa powder, a cup of milk, and a tablespoon of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly, until it reached softball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. The fudge smelled chocolatey and sweet while it cooked. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool for a few minutes without stirring. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. The fudge went from glossy to matte and started to firm up. She poured it into a buttered pan and let it set for several hours. The fudge came out with a slightly grainy texture, not smooth and creamy like fudge made with marshmallow fluff. It had a more intense chocolate flavor and was firmer. You could cut it into neat squares that held their shape. It tasted deeply chocolatey and sweet. A batch cost about 35 cents to make in 1951. By the 1970s, smooth fudge made with marshmallow fluff replaced the old-fashioned grainy kind. The texture people grew up with disappeared. Chocolate fudge vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. It was made with raw peanuts straight from the farm, not roasted peanuts from a can. Peanut brittle was the farmhouse candy made every fall after the peanut harvest. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, and a 1/4 cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly until it reached hard crack stage. When the syrup was ready, golden and thick, she stirred in 2 cups of raw peanuts. The peanuts cooked in the hot syrup for a few minutes until they were toasted and fragrant. Then she added a tablespoon of butter and a teaspoon of baking soda. The mixture foamed up and turned lighter in color. She poured it quickly onto a buttered baking sheet and spread it thin with a spatula. The brittle had to be thin, or it would be too hard to bite. It cooled on the counter and hardened into a thin sheet. When it was completely cool, she broke it into pieces. The peanut brittle was golden and translucent with peanuts throughout. It tasted sweet and nutty with a hint of caramel. The peanuts were crunchy and the brittle snapped when you broke it. Raw peanuts tasted different from roasted ones. They were softer and more earthy. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, roasted peanuts replaced raw ones and the flavor changed. Peanut brittle vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. Maple sugar candy molded boiled syrup into shapes. Coconut bonbons rolled coconut into balls and dipped them in chocolate. Caramel corn baked popcorn in the oven for an hour. Chocolate fudge beat until it turned grainy. Peanut brittle cooked raw peanuts in hot syrup. These were the farmhouse candies everybody knew how to make. They were whole cherries preserved in thick sugar syrup at home, not the bright red dyed ones from the store. Candied cherries were the farmhouse candy made every June when the cherry trees were heavy with fruit. Grandma picked the cherries early in the morning before the sun got too hot. She used a cherry pitter to remove the pits, working over a bowl to catch the juice. The cherries had to stay whole with the stems still attached, if possible. In a heavy pot, she made a thick sugar syrup. 2 cups of sugar and 1 cup of water boiled together until the sugar dissolved and the syrup turned clear and thick. The cherries went into the hot syrup and simmered gently for about 30 minutes. She stirred them carefully so they wouldn't break apart. The cherries absorbed the syrup and turned glossy and translucent. When they were ready, she lifted them out of the syrup with a slotted spoon and laid them on a wire rack to drain. The cherries dried for a day until the syrup crystallized slightly on the outside. Each cherry was dark red, their natural color, not dyed bright red, and coated with a thin layer of crystallized sugar. Grandma packed them in jars with wax paper between the layers so they wouldn't stick together. The candied cherries tasted intensely sweet with a concentrated cherry flavor. They were soft and chewy with a slight crunch from the sugar coating. The natural cherry flavor came through, not artificial or chemical tasting like store-bought candied cherries. She used them in fruitcakes and Christmas cookies or ate them plain as candy. A batch cost almost nothing to make if you had cherry trees, maybe 20 cents for the sugar in 1953. The cherries kept for months in jars, stored in a cool, dark place. By the 1960s, bright red dyed candied cherries from the store replaced homemade ones. The store-bought cherries were uniform in color and size, but they tasted artificial. The natural dark red color and real cherry flavor. They were dark, sticky, and tasted like molasses and butter. Popcorn balls were the farmhouse candy made every Halloween and Christmas. Grandma popped a big pot of popcorn on the stove and poured it into a large bowl. She picked out the unpopped kernels and any burnt pieces. On the stove, she made a thick syrup, 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of sugar, a 1/4 cup of butter, and a tablespoon of vinegar cooked to soft crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard threads. The syrup was dark and smelled sweet and slightly bitter from the molasses. When it was ready, she poured it over the popcorn and stirred quickly with a wooden spoon until every kernel was coated. Then she buttered her hands and started forming balls. She grabbed a handful of the sticky popcorn and squeezed it into a tight ball about the size of a baseball. The molasses held the popcorn together. She wrapped each ball in wax paper and twisted the ends closed. The popcorn balls were dark brown and sticky with a glossy coating. They tasted sweet from the sugar and slightly bitter from the molasses. The butter made them rich. The popcorn stayed crunchy inside, even though the outside was sticky. A batch cost about 20 cents to make in 1951 and made about a dozen balls. They tasted like real browned butter, not artificial butterscotch flavoring. Butterscotch drops were the farmhouse candy made by browning butter with sugar until it caramelized. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and melted a stick of butter over medium heat. Then she added 2 cups of sugar and a 1/4 cup of water. The mixture cooked together, stirring constantly, then until it reached hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads. The candy smelled rich and buttery with a caramel undertone. When it was ready, she dropped spoonfuls onto a buttered baking sheet. Each drop spread out into a thin disk. The candy cooled and hardened into glossy, golden drops. They tasted like butter and caramel with a hint of nuttiness from the browned butter. The flavor was complex and rich, not just sweet. Modern butterscotch flavoring can't replicate the taste of real browned butter. Each drop was hard and dissolved slowly on the tongue. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1952. By the 1960s, artificial butterscotch flavoring replaced real browned butter and the candy tasted flat and chemical. The real butterscotch flavor disappeared. Butterscotch drops vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. Divinity beat hot syrup into egg whites until fluffy. Panouche fudge tasted like maple from brown sugar. Butter Crunch broke teeth with hard toffee. Popcorn balls squeezed sticky molasses, popcorn by hand. Butterscotch drops browned butter until it smelled nutty. These were the farmhouse candies that needed perfect weather and timing. Nobody makes them anymore. It was pure maple syrup boiled down and molded into shapes. Maple sugar candy was the farmhouse treat made every spring during sugaring season. Grandma stood at the stove with a pot of pure maple syrup, the kind they made from their own trees by boiling down the sap for hours. She took the finished syrup and boiled it again to a higher temperature, stirring constantly so it wouldn't burn. The syrup had to reach soft ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball. When it was ready, she took it off the heat and let it cool slightly. Then she beat it with a wooden spoon until it started to thicken and turn lighter in color. She poured the thickened syrup into small metal molds shaped like maple leaves, or poured it onto a buttered pan and let it harden. The candy set up firm and smooth. When it was hard, she popped the shapes out of the molds or cut the sheet into squares. The maple candy was pale tan and tasted intensely of maple, sweet and rich with that distinct maple flavor. It was hard but melted on the tongue. A batch cost nothing but time if you made your own syrup in 1953. By the 1960s, maple syrup became too expensive to use for candy and people stopped making their own. Maple sugar candy vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes it anymore. They were the hand-rolled centers dipped in chocolate coating. Coconut bonbons were the farmhouse candy made with shredded coconut, powdered sugar, and condensed milk rolled into balls and dipped in chocolate. Grandma stood at the counter with a bowl and mixed 2 cups of shredded coconut with 1 cup of powdered sugar. She added half a can of sweetened condensed milk and stirred it until it formed a thick, sticky dough. The dough smelled like coconut and vanilla. She rolled the dough into balls about the size of a walnut and placed them on wax paper to dry for a few hours. The balls firmed up slightly but stayed soft inside. Then she melted chocolate in a double boiler. She used paraffin wax mixed with the chocolate to make it shiny and keep it from melting at room temperature. She dipped each coconut ball into the melted chocolate with a fork, coating it completely, and let the excess drip off. The bonbons went back onto wax paper to harden. The chocolate coating set up firm and glossy. Each bonbon had a soft, sweet coconut center and a thin chocolate shell. They tasted like a Mounds bar, but homemade. The coconut was moist and the chocolate was smooth. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1955 and made about 2 dozen bonbons. By the 1970s, store-bought chocolate-covered coconut candies replaced homemade bonbons. Coconut bonbons vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. They were soft, chewy, and wrapped in individual wax paper squares. Cream caramels were the farmhouse candy made with heavy cream, sugar, and butter that took patience and constant stirring. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, a cup of heavy cream, the thick kind that came from the farm separator, a cup of corn syrup, and a stick of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon. The mixture had to be stirred the entire time, or it would burn on the bottom. She stirred for what felt like forever, watching the mixture bubble and thicken. The kitchen filled with the sweet smell of caramelizing sugar and butter. After about 30 minutes of constant stirring, the mixture reached firm ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a firm ball that held its shape but was still pliable. When it was ready, she added a teaspoon of vanilla and poured the hot caramel into a buttered 9x9 pan. The caramel had to cool completely, several hours or overnight, before she could cut it. When it was firm, she turned it out onto a cutting board and cut it into small rectangles with a buttered knife. Each piece was golden brown and slightly sticky. She wrapped each caramel individually in a square of wax paper, twisting the ends closed so they looked like little presents. The caramels were soft and chewy with a rich, buttery flavor. They tasted like pure caramel, sweet with a hint of salt from the butter. The heavy cream made them smooth and creamy, not grainy. Each piece stuck to your teeth slightly when you chewed it. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1955 and made about 4 dozen caramels. Grandma kept them in a tin and gave them as gifts at Christmas. The caramels stayed soft for weeks if they were wrapped properly. By the 1970s, store-bought caramels were easier to buy than to make, and nobody wanted to stand at the stove stirring for 30 minutes. The individually wrapped homemade caramels disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Cream caramels vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. They were thick, doughy, and tasted like fresh peppermint, not artificial flavoring. Peppermint patties were the farmhouse candy made with homemade fondant and peppermint oil. Grandma stood at the counter and made a batch of no-cook fondant, half a cup of corn syrup mixed with enough powdered sugar to make a stiff dough. She kneaded it with her hands until it was smooth and no longer sticky. Then she added a few drops of pure peppermint oil, not extract, the concentrated oil, and kneaded it again until the peppermint was distributed throughout. The fondant turned white and smelled intensely minty. She pinched off pieces of fondant and rolled them into balls about the size of a walnut. Then she flattened each ball into a thick disc, about half an inch thick, and placed them on wax paper to dry overnight. The patties had to dry until they formed a slight crust on the outside, but stayed soft inside. The next day, she melted chocolate in a double boiler. She used real chocolate mixed with a little paraffin wax to make it shiny and keep it from melting at room temperature. She dipped each fondant patty into the melted chocolate with a fork, coating it completely. The excess chocolate dripped off, and she set each patty back on wax paper to harden. The chocolate coating set up firm and glossy. Each peppermint patty had a thick, soft fondant center and a thin chocolate shell. They looked like the York peppermint patties you buy at the store, but they were thicker and the fondant was doughier. The patties tasted intensely minty with a creamy fondant center. The chocolate was dark and rich. The peppermint oil gave them a cooling sensation on the tongue. The fondant was soft and dissolved slowly. A batch cost about 50 cents to make in 1954 and made about 2 dozen patties. Grandma served them at church socials and holiday gatherings. The thick, doughy fondant was what made them special. They weren't thin and crispy like modern peppermint patties. By the 1970s, store-bought York peppermint patties dominated, and the homemade thick fondant style seemed old-fashioned. Peppermint patties vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Nobody makes them anymore. It wasn't fancy, but lemon drops were a lovable farmhouse, hard candy made with sugar, corn syrup, and fresh lemon juice. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, half a cup of corn syrup, and half a cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally with a wooden spoon, until the mixture reached hard crack stage, about 300 degrees on a candy thermometer. The syrup turned clear and thick, bubbling steadily. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into a cup of cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads, she took it off the heat and let it cool for 1 minute. Then she stirred in the juice of 2 fresh lemons, squeezing them by hand over a strainer to catch the seeds. A few drops of yellow food coloring went in next, turning the syrup bright sunshine yellow. The mixture smelled intensely lemony, and the kitchen filled with the bright, sharp scent of citrus. She poured the hot syrup onto a buttered marble slab, or, if she didn't have a marble slab, onto a buttered baking sheet. The syrup spread out in a thin, glossy pool. The candy cooled for about 5 minutes until she could handle it without burning her fingers. Then she cut it into small pieces with buttered scissors, working quickly before it hardened completely. Each piece was about the size of a marble. While the candy was still slightly warm and tacky, she rolled each piece in coarse sanding sugar with large crystals that sparkled like tiny diamonds. The sugar stuck to the surface and gave each lemon drop a rough, sparkly coating. The sanding sugar kept the drops from sticking together in the jar. The lemon drops cooled completely and hardened into bright yellow candies. They tasted intensely lemony and sour, with a hard, crunchy texture that dissolved slowly on the tongue. Each drop lasted for several minutes, getting smaller and smaller as you sucked on it. The coarse sugar coating gave them a slight crunch at first, then melted away to reveal the smooth, hard candy underneath. Grandma kept the lemon drops in a glass jar with a tight-fitting lid. They stayed fresh for weeks if stored properly. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1952. The fresh lemon juice gave them a bright, natural lemon flavor that artificial lemon flavoring couldn't match. But by the 1960s, lemon-flavored hard candies made with artificial flavoring replaced homemade lemon drops. The artificial flavor was stronger and more consistent, but it tasted chemical and flat, like lemon furniture polish instead of real lemons. The bright, fresh lemon flavor from real lemon juice disappeared. The coarse, sugar-coated lemon drops vanished from farmhouse kitchens. Lemon drops disappeared. Nobody boils sugar and fresh lemon juice on the stove anymore. The sanded coating that kept them from sticking is gone. The hard candies that tasted like real lemons are forgotten. With a red, glass-hard cinnamon syrup version. Candied apples with a farmhouse candy made with a bright red cinnamon sugar coating that cracked like glass when you bit into it. They were different from caramel apples. These had a hard candy shell, not a soft caramel coating. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of white sugar, 1 cup of water, and half a cup of small red cinnamon candies. The tiny, hard candies called red hots that burned your tongue with cinnamon heat. She cooked the mixture over medium heat, stirring occasionally until the sugar and candies dissolved completely. The mixture turned bright, a translucent red, an artificial-looking red that was almost neon. The candy syrup had to reach hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads that snapped cleanly. While the syrup cooked, she prepared the apples. She washed them in cool water and dried them completely with a towel. Any moisture on the apple would make the candy coating slide off or turn cloudy. She used tart apples, Granny Smith or wine sap, because their sourness balanced the sweet coating. She pushed a wooden stick into the stem end of each apple, pushing it in about 2 inches so the stick was secure and wouldn't pull out when the apple was dipped. When the syrup was ready, bright red, thick, and reaching 300 degrees on the candy thermometer, she worked quickly. She tilted the pot slightly and dipped each apple into the hot red syrup one at a time, turning it slowly to coat all sides evenly. The syrup had to be very hot, or it would start to set up and wouldn't coat smoothly. She let the excess syrup drip off for a few seconds, turning the apple slowly so the coating would be even, and then set each apple upright on a buttered baking sheet to cool. The coating hardened quickly, within minutes, into a glass-like shell. Each candied apple was bright red and shiny like a Christmas ornament. The coating was about 1/8 of an inch thick and completely covered the apple. When you bit into a candied apple, the coating shattered dramatically and pieces fell off. The cold, tart apple crunched underneath. The coating tasted intensely of cinnamon with a burning heat and overwhelming sweetness. The tart apple balanced it. Grandma made candied apples for Halloween and fall festivals. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1953. By the 1970s, the glass-hard coating seemed dangerous. It could crack a tooth or cut your mouth. Candied apples vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. They were the chewy, dark cousins of saltwater taffy. Molasses Kisses were the farmhouse candy made with molasses, sugar, and butter pulled until glossy. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of sugar, and a tablespoon of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally until it reached hardball stage. The mixture turned dark and smelled rich and slightly bitter from the molasses. The kitchen filled with the deep, earthy aroma of boiling molasses. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a hard ball, she poured it onto a buttered marble slab or a large buttered baking sheet. The candy spread out thin and steamed on the cool surface. She let it cool for a few minutes until she could handle it without burning her hands. Then she buttered her hands thoroughly and started pulling the candy. She stretched it out as far as her arms could reach and folded it back on itself. Candy was dark brown and sticky at first. It took strength to pull it. The molasses made it thick and resistant. As she pulled it, the color lightened slightly from dark brown to a lighter chocolate brown. The candy developed a satiny sheen. After about 15 minutes of continuous pulling, the candy was glossy and had a firm, chewy texture. Her arms ached from the pulling, but the candy had transformed. She rolled it into a long rope about 1 inch thick and cut it into small pieces with buttered scissors. Each piece was about the size of a walnut. She wrapped each molasses kiss individually in a square of wax paper, twisting the ends closed so they looked like little candies in their wrappers. The molasses kisses were dark brown and glossy on the outside. They tasted rich and slightly bitter with a deep molasses flavor that filled your mouth. The texture was chewy, firmer than taffy, but softer than hard candy. Each piece stuck to your teeth slightly when you chewed it. The molasses flavor was intense and complex, not just sweet, but with a mineral, earthy undertone that reminded you of sorghum and farm fields. Grandma kept the molasses kisses in a tin lined with wax paper, and they stayed soft for weeks if wrapped properly. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1951 and made about 3 dozen pieces. By the 1960s, saltwater taffy with bright fruit flavors replaced molasses kisses. The dark, bitter molasses flavor wasn't as popular as cherry, banana, and vanilla. The chewy molasses candy wrapped in wax paper disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Molasses kisses vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. It was bright pink, sugar-crusted peanut discs. Peanut patties were the farmhouse candy made with peanuts and pink sugar syrup. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, half a cup of milk, and a tablespoon of butter. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon until it reached softball stage. The mixture smelled sweet and creamy. The milk gave it a rich, caramel-like aroma. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed a soft ball that flattened when pressed. She took it off the heat and added a few drops of red food coloring. She stirred it through, and the mixture turned bright pink. Not a pale pink, but a vibrant, almost neon pink that looked artificial but cheerful. Then she stirred in 2 cups of raw peanuts. The peanuts had to be raw, not roasted, so they would soften slightly in the hot syrup and absorb some of the sugar flavor. She stirred the mixture vigorously with the wooden spoon. As she stirred, the mixture started to thicken and lose its shine. It went from glossy to matte. She had to work quickly now. She dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper spread out on the kitchen counter. Each spoonful spread out into a flat disc about 3 inches across. The patties had to be dropped fast because the candy set up quickly. Within seconds, the mixture would become too thick to drop. Each patty was bright pink and studded with peanuts throughout. The sugar coating crystallized on the outside as it cooled, giving each patty a rough, sugary crust. The patties cooled on the wax paper and hardened into firm discs within minutes. They tasted sweet and peanutty with a grainy sugar texture on the outside. The pink color made them festive and fun. They looked like party candy. The peanuts were slightly soft and chewy from being cooked in the hot syrup. Each patty was thick and substantial. not thin and brittle like peanut brittle. The sugar crust gave them a slight crunch on the outside, but they were soft and chewy inside. Grandma made peanut patties for church bake sales and holiday gatherings. The bright pink color made them stand out on the candy table among all the brown and white candies. A batch cost about 40 cents to make in 1953 and made about 2 dozen patties. By the 1970s, people thought the pink color looked artificial and old-fashioned. Natural colors became trendy, and bright pink seemed garish. Sugar-crusted peanut patties disappeared from farmhouse kitchens and church bake sales. Peanut patties vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. It was the fragile, striped holiday classic that was too hard to ship. Ribbon candy was the farmhouse candy made by pulling colored sugar syrup into thin, decorative ribbons. Grandma stood at the stove with a heavy pot and poured in 2 cups of sugar, half a cup of corn syrup, and half a cup of water. She cooked it over medium heat, stirring occasionally until the sugar dissolved. Then she stopped stirring and let it cook until it reached hard crack stage. The syrup turned clear and thick. When it was ready, tested by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads, she divided the hot syrup into 3 smaller pots. She worked quickly because the syrup cooled fast. She colored 1 batch bright red with food coloring, 1 green, and left 1 white. The 3 colors would make traditional Christmas ribbon candy. She poured each colored syrup onto a separate buttered marble slab. The candy cooled for a few minutes until she could handle it without burning herself. Then she pulled each color separately with thoroughly buttered hands, stretching it out and folding it back until it was glossy and had a satiny sheen. The pulling incorporated air and made the candy less brittle. And all 3 colors were pulled to the right consistency, glossy and slightly translucent, she rolled each one into a long rope about the thickness of a pencil. She laid the 3 ropes side by side, red, white, and green in that order, and pressed them together gently so they would stick. Then she picked up the 3-colored rope and started forming it into ribbons. She folded the rope back and forth in a zigzag pattern, creating waves and curves like fabric ribbons. The ribbon candy had to be formed while it was still warm enough to bend without cracking. As it cooled, it hardened into delicate, unstriped ribbons that looked almost like glass. Each piece was fragile and translucent with stripes of red, white, and green running through it. The colors didn't bleed together. They stayed distinct and clear. The ribbon candy was purely decorative. It looked too pretty to eat, but when you did eat it, it tasted like peppermint or wintergreen with a hard, crunchy texture. Each piece shattered when you bit into it. Grandma displayed the ribbon candy in a glass bowl at Christmas. The light shining through it made it sparkle. A batch took hours to make and cost about 50 cents in 1955. By the 1960s, ribbon candy became too fragile to ship and too time-consuming to make at home. Factory-made ribbon candy appeared in stores, but it was thicker and less delicate than homemade. The hand-pulled, fragile ribbon candy disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Ribbon candy vanished. Nobody makes it anymore. They were infused with real vanilla beans, a rare farm luxury. Vanilla caramels were the farmhouse candy made with heavy cream, sugar, butter, and a whole vanilla bean. Vanilla beans were expensive and hard to find in rural areas in the 1950s. They had to be ordered from catalogs or purchased in specialty stores in the city. When Grandma had a vanilla bean, she saved it for something special. Vanilla caramels were that special occasion. She stood at the stove with a heavy pot and carefully split a vanilla bean down the middle, lengthwise with a sharp knife. She scraped out the thousands of tiny black seeds with the back of the knife and added both the seeds and the scraped pod to the pot. The pod still had flavor in it. Then she poured in 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of heavy cream, the thick kind from the farm separator, 1 cup of light corn syrup, and 1 stick of butter cut into pieces. She cooked the mixture over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon. The mixture had to be stirred the entire time, 30 minutes or more, or it would burn on the bottom and ruin the batch. The kitchen filled with the most incredible sweet floral smell of vanilla. It was stronger and more complex than vanilla extract. As she stirred, The mixture bubbled and thickened. The color darkened from cream to golden brown. After about 30 minutes of constant stirring, the mixture reached firm ball stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water. It should form a firm ball that held its shape, but was still slightly pliable. When it was ready, she fished out the vanilla bean pod with a spoon and scraped off any caramel clinging to it. Then, she poured the hot caramel into a buttered 9x9 pan. The tiny black vanilla seeds were suspended throughout the golden caramel-like pepper specks. The caramel cooled for several hours or overnight until it was firm enough to cut. When it was set, she turned it out onto a cutting board and cut it into small rectangles with a buttered knife. Each piece had tiny black specks throughout. She wrapped each caramel individually in wax paper squares, twisting the ends closed. The vanilla caramels were soft and chewy with an intense vanilla flavor. They tasted rich and buttery with the floral, complex flavor of real vanilla bean, not the flat, one-dimensional taste of vanilla extract. The tiny black seeds added visual interest and proved real vanilla bean was used. A batch cost about $1 to make in 1956 because vanilla beans were so expensive. By the 1970s, vanilla extract replaced vanilla beans. The caramels infused with real vanilla bean disappeared from farmhouse kitchens. Vanilla caramels vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. It wasn't fancy, but date nut roll was a lovable farmhouse candy on every Christmas table. Grandma stood at the kitchen counter with a bowl of pitted dates, soft, sticky, and dark as molasses, and ran them through the meat grinder, one handful at a time. The dates came out in a thick, sticky paste that clung to the grinder blades and smelled like deep caramel. She scraped the date paste into a mixing bowl and stirred in half a cup of powdered sugar and a teaspoon of vanilla extract. The date mixture turned glossy and sweet, sticky enough to pull apart in long strings when you lifted the spoon. She laid out a big piece of wax paper on the counter and dusted it heavily with powdered sugar, coating the surface like fresh snow. The date mixture went onto the wax paper, and she used her hands, dusted with more powdered sugar to keep the dates from sticking, to pat and roll it out into a rectangle about a 1/4 inch thick. Then came the walnuts. She laid a row of walnut halves down the center of the date rectangle, end to end, making a straight line of walnuts that would run through the heart of the roll. The next part took patience. She lifted one edge of the wax paper and rolled the date mixture over the walnuts, folding it like a blanket and encasing them completely. The roll had to be tight, so the walnuts would stay in the center and not shift to one side. She kept rolling until the date mixture formed a log about 2 inches thick, with the walnuts running through the center like a hidden treasure. Then she rolled the entire log in more powdered sugar, coating it completely so it wouldn't stick. The date nut roll went down to the cellar to cure for 3 days. The cool air made it firm up, turning the sticky paste into a sliceable candy. When it was ready, Grandma sliced it into rounds about 1/2 inch thick. Each slice was perfect, a dark date ring on the outside and walnut halves in the center, like a beautiful cross-section. The date nut roll tasted rich and fruity, with chewy dates and crunchy walnuts in every bite. The powdered sugar coating kept the slices from sticking together and added a sweet dusting on your fingers. The dates were intensely sweet, almost like caramel. The walnuts added texture and a slight bitterness that balanced the sweetness. A batch cost about 60 cents to make in 1954, and Grandma made them for Christmas, wrapping each roll in wax paper to give as gifts. But by the 1960s, people didn't want to wait 3 days for candy to cure. Nougat bars packed honey and almonds into chewy bars. Caramel apples dipped tart farm apples in thick caramel. Marzipan shaped almond paste into tiny fruits. Lemon drops rolled hard candy in coarse sugar. Date nut roll wrapped dates around walnut halves. These were the farmhouse candies that took days to make. Nobody makes them anymore. They were oven-roasted with egg whites and cinnamon. Sugared pecans were the farmhouse candy made by coating pecans in a cinnamon sugar mixture and baking them low and slow until crispy. Grandma stood at the counter with a large bowl and cracked one egg. She separated the egg white into the bowl and saved the yolk for something else. On halves, pecans from the farm trees that the kids had shelled the week before went into the egg white mixture. She stirred gently with a spoon until every pecan half was coated with the frothy egg white. Then she lifted the pecans out with a slotted spoon, letting the excess egg white drip back into the bowl, and dropped them into the cinnamon sugar mixture. She stirred and tossed the pecans until every piece was coated completely with the spiced sugar. Some pecans clumped together, and she separated them with her fingers. The sugared pecans spread out on a large buttered baking sheet in a single layer. She made sure they weren't touching each other so they wouldn't stick together as they baked. The baking sheet went into a low oven, 250 degrees, and baked for 1 hour. She set a timer and stirred the pecans every 15 minutes with a spatula so they would coat evenly, brown evenly, and not burn. The pecans came out golden brown and crispy with a thick coating of crystallized cinnamon sugar. The sugar had caramelized slightly in the oven. The pecans cooled on the pan, and the sugar coating hardened into a crunchy shell. Each pecan was coated completely and tasted sweet, spicy, and slightly salty. The cinnamon gave them warmth. The egg white made the coating stick and turn crispy in the oven. They were addictive, crunchy, and sweet with a hint of spice. Grandma kept sugared pecans in a tin and served them at Christmas. A batch cost about 70 cents to make in 1954. The pecans stayed crispy for weeks if stored in an airtight container. By the 1970s, our simpler candied nuts replaced the egg white and cinnamon version. Sugared pecans vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. Or hard-boiled ginger sugar drops made for digestion. Ginger candy drops were the farmhouse candy made with fresh ginger root and sugar. People ate them after heavy meals to settle their stomachs or when they felt nauseous. Ginger was considered medicinal in the 1950s. Grandma stood at the counter with a piece of fresh ginger root about 3 inches long and as thick as her thumb. She peeled it carefully with the edge of a spoon, scraping off the thin, papery skin to reveal the pale yellow flesh underneath. Then she grated the peeled ginger fine on the smallest holes of a box grater. The grated ginger was stringy and fibrous and smelled sharp and spicy. Her eyes watered from the strong ginger fumes. The grated ginger went into a heavy pot with 2 cups of white sugar, 1 cup of water, and half a cup of light corn syrup. She cooked the mixture over medium heat, stirring occasionally with a wooden spoon. The ginger infused into the syrup as it cooked, turning it slightly cloudy and golden. The kitchen filled with the sharp, spicy smell of ginger. The mixture had to reach hard crack stage. She tested it by dropping a spoonful into cold water until it formed hard, brittle threads that snapped. When it was ready, she strained the hot syrup through a fine mesh strainer to remove all the grated ginger pieces. She pressed on the ginger pieces with the back of a spoon to extract all the flavor and liquid. The strained ginger-infused syrup was clear and golden. She poured it onto a buttered marble slab or a large buttered baking sheet. The candy cooled for a few minutes until she could handle it without burning her hands. Then she cut it into small pieces with buttered scissors, working quickly before the candy hardened completely. Each piece was about the size of a marble. The ginger drops cooled rapidly and hardened into clear golden candies. They were translucent and glossy. You could almost see through them if you held them up to the light. The ginger drops tasted intensely spicy and hot from the fresh ginger. The heat built slowly as you sucked on the candy, starting mild and gradually getting hotter. Each drop was hard and dissolved slowly on the tongue, lasting for several minutes. The ginger helped with digestion and settled upset stomachs. The fresh ginger gave the drops a bright, clean, almost floral flavor that was different from dried ginger powder. The drops were spicy but not overwhelming. Grandma kept ginger drops in a jar by the stove and took one when her stomach was upset. A batch cost about 30 cents to make in 1951. By the 1960s, ginger candies made with artificial flavoring replaced homemade ones. The fresh, bright ginger flavor disappeared. Ginger candy drops vanished. Nobody makes them anymore. 60 farmhouse candies that nobody makes anymore? Sorghum candy, boiled down farm syrup until it snapped. Hickory nut candy, cracked wild nuts by hand. Buttermilk fudge used leftover buttermilk from churning butter. Each one took hours or days to make. Each one used ingredients that came straight from the farm, not from a store. Grandma stood at the stove stirring molasses for an hour. She pulled taffy until her arms ached. She dipped fondant centers in melted chocolate one by one. She wrapped each caramel in wax paper and twisted the ends closed. The candies sat in glass jars on the pantry shelf or in tins lined with wax paper. They were given as Christmas gifts and served at church socials. They were made with fresh ginger root, real vanilla beans, and farm cream so thick you could stand a spoon in it. By the 1970s, everything changed. Corn syrup replaced sorghum and honey. Artificial flavoring replaced fresh ginger and real vanilla beans. And below and tell us which farmhouse candy you remember. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more forgotten recipes. Once these candies are gone, they're gone forever.